Okay, so thanks for joining, everyone. I think we're just about ready to get started here. Okay, yep, I see Aaron's been able to join the call. Let me just introduce myself and Aaron, and then we'll jump into the session here. So. My name is David Wilcox. I'm the program leader for Fedora here at LYRASIS, and Erin Griffith is the program coordinator. She'll be working with me just to help with managing some of the chat and some of the questions during the session today. So let me jump in here, and as I said, Erin's going to try to help answer some questions that folks might have specific to the instances or the slides or anything like that while I'm going through the presentation here. This is focused on Fedora 6.0, which is the latest release of the software, actually currently in beta, but will be publicly released over the next few months. And the outcomes here are really just to try to provide a sense of what Fedora can do for you, as well as giving you an overview of the key capabilities of the software, particularly the new features that have been introduced in 6.0, and also to get some hands-on experience using the sandbox instances. So if you're new to Fedora, this is just sort of a high-level description of what the software does, what it provides. Basically, Fedora is open source repository software, stores, preserves, and provides access to digital objects, and also supports flexible content models for those objects. So one of the features that Fedora provides really is the sense of flexibility in being able to organize your content however you choose and model it however you choose. Largely, this is achieved by supporting semantic relationships between objects. So if you're familiar with linked data and RDF, this is what Fedora uses to build linkages between resources in the repository. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the details here. Fedora is scalable, and this is particularly true with version 6, support for millions of objects, both large and small. We've been doing some testing with version 6.0 to really prove out the performance and scale capabilities, and we'll have some really good data to share with everyone on that quite soon. So far, we've had no issues testing with 20 or 30 million objects, and we're quite confident that it can handle more than that, but we'll have the data to share for that quite soon. Another thing that Fedora offers, fundamentally is this notion of interoperability. So, Fedora is designed with a pretty small feature set, which we'll go over today. And the idea is that you use different applications and services along with Fedora to create a kind of repository ecosystem. So in terms of the value proposition and why people tend to choose Fedora and adopt it, again, this notion of flexibility, I think, is really core to the use cases for Fedora, being able to handle both simple use cases, but also more complex ones. And sometimes when you're starting out with a repository, your use cases are fairly simple, but they can grow in complexity over time. So starting with a system like Fedora will allow you to sort of adopt more and more complex use cases without having to fundamentally change your software architecture. But another key component here is this notion of durability. And again, this is even more pronounced in version 6 of the software. Fedora has always had a commitment to digital preservation, but in version 4 and 5, we kind of shifted our focus a bit to the more front-facing linked data features, the API features. And now with version 6, we've really returned to this focus on long-term digital preservation and content durability. I think it's also fair to say that Fedora has been successful. There are hundreds of instances all over the world using a variety of different application frameworks. And this is, of course, important for any piece of software that you might be considering adopting. But as well, Fedora is really standards-based, and I think this is really important for those that want to make sure that you keep control of your data, that you're able to get data out of the system in standardized formats, so that you always have the option to migrate to a different application in the future. And so that's something that Fedora is really focused on, is doing everything to the extent possible in accordance with broadly adopted international web standards. And finally, I think it's worth mentioning the community. Fedora is an open source program, but it is also community supported. And it's really this community that gives Fedora its strength. And it's one of the main reasons why people choose to adopt Fedora compared to other open source projects that may not have the same kind of community around them. And that community really helps if you have staff turnover, or if you have gaps in your local resources, or just have questions. The community is really responsive and able to help out whenever folks ask questions, whether it's on the mailing list or on Slack or at meetings and workshops like this. And so in terms of Fedora 6.0, you may be wondering what's new. And there are a few things that I think bear mentioning. I talked earlier about the digital preservation capabilities. We've adopted a new standard called the Oxford Common File Layout, which helps us more clearly define how content is laid out at the storage layer to support digital preservation best practices, which I think is something that the community has been asking for some time. But equally important, Fedora 6.0 brings with it really robust migration tooling. So if you happen to be running Fedora version 3 or 4 or 5, we have tooling now to support migrations from all of those versions into the latest version of the software. We've also added a new simple search feature, which we'll get to try out a little bit today. This isn't intended to replace something like Solr or Elasticsearch as a more kind of robust public search endpoint. Really, this is just for developers and people that are working on the software and need to be able to do some quick searches on keywords and things like that without having to set up a whole external search infrastructure. But it's something that the technical community has been asking for, and so it's an additional feature that we've added this time around. I mentioned the performance and scale already, and we'll be sending some metrics out to the community again quite soon to sort of demonstrate those capabilities. But we also have a bunch of tests that you can run locally, and we'd be very interested to hear if you have use cases for preservation and scale. We want to make sure that we're meeting those use cases, and there are tests that we can run, but there's also a variety of test suites that you can run locally if you have your own criteria that you're trying to evaluate Fedora based on. And we have actually added some nice new features around metrics collection and reporting. And here I'm talking mostly about being able to kind of pop up a dashboard and monitor in real time or get a report on the various kind of applications and services that are running in the context of Fedora to be able to measure those metrics and report out on them. So that's kind of a nice new feature that's been added for the kind of systems administration side of things. I think it's also worth mentioning that Fedora is commonly used with front-end application frameworks. We tend to think of it as middleware. There are very few instances where someone is just using Fedora on its own without anything else interacting with it. That might be a use case if it's just kind of a dark archive scenario, but for any kind of public-facing access, Fedora is generally used either in the context of building a custom framework, which lots of people do, or by using a community-based solution. The two most popular solutions are Samvera and Islandora. There's lots of, these are both their own communities. Each have, well over 100 sites that are in countries around the world. And we are doing some testing with both of these in the context of Fedora 6 now. Islandora is actually already integrated the beta version of Fedora 6 into the software and resolved a couple of minor issues, but we're confident that that's now working. We've done some early testing with Samvera and hope to do some additional testing in the next few months to verify that Fedora 6 works with the latest versions of Samvera applications as well. So just a few examples here of some sites that are based on Fedora, and the URLs are included in the slides if you want to explore some of these. Again, if you're new to the software and just wondering what Fedora-based installations tend to look like at different institutions around the world. So institutional repository is a pretty common use case. This is a Samvera-based application that's running at George Washington University. The URL is there. These are all public sites that you can visit if you like. So theses and dissertations, sort of local scholarly work. Fedora is on the back end, and on the front end is a Samvera application stack that supports a variety of use cases. In the context of something like research data, the University of Michigan has a nice data repository that is also based on Samvera, using kind of different components, bit of a different look and feel, but also using Fedora on the back end here. And research data is generally a pretty good use case for Fedora because of the flexible content modeling. Newspapers and generally kind of paged content, so scanned books, postcards, anything like that. Another common use case for Fedora. This case at the University of Maryland, this is a custom front end built on Fedora with some nice searching and viewer features. I believe they're using the IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework, to display the newspapers on the sites and allow for some nice zooming and browsing features. But these kinds of special collection scenarios are fairly common. There's a growing number of Islandora sites that are now being built on modern versions of Fedora. This is one such site out of New Zealand that has just kind of a variety of special collections and also has some nice multilingual features. Islandora sites are built using Drupal as the front end, and Drupal offers a lot of flexibility in terms of how you build the website. So yeah, all of these have kind of a different look and feel. But the sort of common denominator here is that Fedora is sort of at the back end of the site, handling the sort of storage and preservation features. So I've got a few fundamental comments here, and I should just reiterate that if there's kind of questions throughout the workshop, the easiest thing to do is just to type them into the chat or the Q&A box. And again, Aaron, if you see questions and you want to sort of unmute and jump in if it's relevant for me to answer, I'm happy to do that sort of as we go through things here.
Sounds good.
So again, just kind of at a very high level here, talking about the fundamental concepts that Fedora provides. Everything in the repository is a resource, and specifically a web resource, so it gets kind of a unique identifier. And really, even though you can create lots of complex structures in Fedora, there's only two types of things that are really in the repository. And those are container resources and binary resources. And containers really are just kind of metadata resources, so they're descriptive. So if you create a collection, your collection is a container. If you create kind of a top level book or newspaper object, it's a container, and it has metadata that describes that resource in more detail. And then you can upload files, and Fedora can support any kind of file. These might be PDFs or image files, audio, video resources, anything like that. We tend to refer to these as binaries. And so you just have these containers and binaries, and then based on that, you can build out a repository structure. Any of these resources can be described using one or more properties. These properties are basically RDF triples. We won't have time in this presentation to go into a lot of depth about sort of linked data principles, but if you're familiar with linked data, that's something that Fedora supports natively. However, it's worth noting that a lot of repositories use binary formats like XML to describe the resources. So things like Dublin core or mods records stored as XML are very common. And it's no trouble to store those in Fedora as well. They're just stored as binary files rather than containers, but they can be linked to the resources that they describe. And you can build out a kind of hierarchy. So resources can contain other resources, or they can contain binaries. So you can kind of build out a structure within the repository. And I do have an example of that right here. So this is sort of a typical example of a collection of books that you might have in a repository. And so in the Fedora context, you might have a book collection. That collection is itself a container. It probably has some properties that describe it, at least the title of book collection. And then within that collection, you may have one or more books. And those books The top level book is a container. It probably has some metadata that describe it, like the title and the author and publication info, etc. And then your book has one or more pages, and those pages can themselves be containers, so they can be sort of descriptive objects that contain metadata about the page, even if it's just the page number, but it could be other things as well. And then at some point, you're probably uploading either born digital or scanned book pages, and those can be represented as binary files that are associated with the pages themselves. This is just an example structure. You could have a much simpler structure where you're not having separate containers for pages, and you just have a series of images for each page that are all associated with a book object, or you might just have a PDF of the book that's associated with the book object. So you can kind of describe and organize your collections however you want. This is just sort of a fairly typical hierarchy. And all of these lines that link together the collection and the books and the pages, etc. These are all just metadata relationships. They're just RDF properties that connect up each of these resources together. So if you had, that's one way to organize a book, but you could actually store it in Fedora in a totally flat structure, but still present the same kind of hierarchy to a user by using these RDF relationships. So whether you're storing the book in a sort of hierarchy in the repository, or you're just storing it totally flat and then using RDF relationships to kind of build up the hierarchy that you want to present to users, both of those are possible in Fedora, and it just gives you a lot of flexibility. So you might have books that belong to more than one collection. You might have pages that belong to more than one book. And in those cases, you can kind of store them wherever you want in the repository, and then just build up relationships to present them to users in different ways. And so this isn't a use case that necessarily everyone has. If your use cases are fairly simple, then simply storing things kind of hierarchically and presenting them in one way is maybe the easiest way to go. But you can also do more sort of complex things, which is what's being illustrated here.
David, there is just a question in the chat there. It says, how are language siblings of the same content connected in Fedora?
So I might need a little bit more context on that question. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by language siblings, language versions. So you're talking here about if you have a content that is described in more than one language, sort of multilingual content, and how sort of those things are, how they're connected. And I'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll sort of proceed assuming you're just talking about kind of things where you have multiple languages. So multilingual support really isn't too challenging to handle. Everything is described in RDF properties. So if you have more than one language, you can indicate using those properties that this is the English title and this is the title in French, or whatever. So you can sort of use the structures of RDF to indicate that certain the things are stored in more than one language. I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question correctly, so feel free if you want to send me an email afterwards or something like that to get into a little bit more detail. I'm probably misinterpreting your question a little bit. But sorry, I couldn't be a little bit more helpful there. And this is just an example of if you have a resource and you're describing it using properties. And again, you can use properties, or you can use XML metadata, whatever your kind of standard is for describing things. You can use whatever works for you at your institution. But if you're using RDF properties, this is just kind of how they look in when they're stored in Fedora. And then if you have a front end, you can kind of display these things however you'd like to display them. And just a note about standards, again, the Fedora API itself, so the application programming interface, is its own specification, so it is a standard. There's a link to it in the slides. And that just helps if you're building an application on Fedora, if you want to understand how it works. Really, the Fedora API is just a collection of existing standards. I'll talk a little bit about those, but we're really something we're really focused on is for everything that we want to do with Fedora, we're trying to find a standardized way of doing it rather than doing things in a really custom way. We did a lot of custom stuff in the past, and that ended up being very difficult to maintain. So we're really trying to move into a more standardized direction. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the core features here, and then I'm going to flip over to some hands-on stuff. So we'll be able to kind of walk through some exercises here and test out the software, and I'm happy to answer more questions as we go along. So this slide, I'm going to linger here for a minute and just kind of explain what's going on in this slide. I'm trying to just illustrate here the core services, the core features that Fedora provides, and the standards by which it provides those features. So on the left, you have in the sort of black bold type, these are the sort of the standards, the features. And on the right, in the kind of lighter gray type, these are the standards. So features on the left and standards on the right. And we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail, so I won't say too much on this particular slide, but this does kind of give you at a high level all of the things that Fedora does out of the box. So it's things like your basic kind of create, read, update, delete. This is just resource management stuff, being able to create things and delete them, etc. We're using a standard called the linked data platform that defines how those things happen in the context of Fedora. It's its own standard, and I won't sort of go into a ton of detail here on the standard itself, but just to note that we're sort of doing this in compliance with this particular standard. Fedora does also support versioning, so whenever you make changes in the repository, you can optionally create versions to track those changes. We're using a standard called Memento to provide those, which I'll say more about in a bit. Authorization, which is so security and access controls, defining users and groups and how they can access content and what they can access. That's all being done in accordance with web access controls, or WebAC, which is an emerging standard. Fedora also does fixity, so being able to verify that files have not changed over time, that they haven't been corrupted. And we're just using some HTTP link headers there to manage that. The simple search is a new one, and this, if anything, is the one feature where right now we're doing this in a fairly customized way. Hopefully in the future that can be done by adopting a broader standard, but we'll take a look at the feature in detail as we go here. And towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about messaging. Messaging is a little bit different. These first 5 features are all provided through APIs, through application programming interfaces, which is a fairly standard way of interacting with the repository. The messaging is a little bit different. It's kind of triggered off of events that happen in the repository, and it's really just a different way of integrating external services. But I'll say more about that later. This is just kind of a preview of what we're going to cover in the rest of the workshop. And activity streams is just a standard for messaging. So, the point here is just to kind of give you a broad overview of the features that Fedora has and the kind of standards that we're trying to work with in the context of the technology. So again, create, read, update, delete, what's commonly called CRUD. These are just, it's kind of a standards-based pattern for creating and managing resources. And there are some basic tools, for kind of modeling content. Mostly you can do this in a few ways. We're going to use an HTML interface. So that's when you log into the instance from the spreadsheet. That's what you're seeing is a kind of web view of Fedora. It is actually, you are interacting with the API when you're using this interface. It's just presented as a website, which is much easier to use for folks that are not familiar with using command line tools and things like that. But it is a little bit more limited. For more comprehensive access, if you're really trying to interact with the Fedora API in detail, using some kind of a client, curl is pretty popular on the command line, but there's lots of different programming languages that can handle that. But don't worry about that too much if you're not a developer and you don't spend a lot of time in the command line. We're not really going to be doing anything with the command line in this particular workshop. So I'm going to jump back into my browser. So should still be sharing here, and I'll close a couple of windows. So hopefully you can see my browser and the various kind of tabs that are open. For this part of the workshop, I'm going to be jumping back and forth a little bit from the slides to the sandbox instance itself, so I can do a little bit of demoing here. If you're trying to follow along, this is one of the kind of challenging parts about sort of doing online workshops. If you have two monitors, this might be easier. If you're just on one monitor, which is all I'm doing, you may want to have your Zoom window kind of on one side of your screen and your sandbox open on the other side of your screen, just so you can kind of watch both happening at once. And I'm just going to have my tabs. I'll have the slides in one tab and the sandbox in the other tab. And I'm just going to move my little Zoom control panel over so it doesn't get in the way. So hopefully you've claimed an instance. And again, if you want to put something in the chat, Aaron can help you out there. And these are the username and password if you don't have those. If you load up your instance, and again, let me know if you're not seeing what I'm describing on my screen, but you should see the Fedora logo here and the instance that I've claimed for myself. You can click the REST API endpoint button, and that should take you to kind of the top level of your repository. And so if you're viewing Fedora from the kind of web interface perspective, this is what you'll see. So if you can get here, great, you'll be able to follow along, and we can kind of proceed from here. So I'm going to be flipping back and forth a little bit. Apologies for that. The next slide here is really just a reference, and it's more of a technical reference. So if you're not a developer, this probably is less relevant to you. But if you just wanted to know how the various kind of REST API verbs attach on to the elements of the interface, this is just meant to illustrate that. But again, if you're not a developer, if you're not familiar with REST APIs and how they work, don't worry about it. We won't need to kind of reference this as we go. The way I've structured these slides, just before I jump in, because it could be a little bit confusing, there are instructions here that are meant to tell you what you can do in the HTML interface to complete these exercises. These kind of red boxes on the bottom, these are the equivalent commands that you could run on the command line to do basically the same thing. So in the context of this workshop, again, we're just going to be using the HTML interface. But if you wanted to go back later, or if you have developers that wanted to know, kind of have a reference for how to actually interact on the command line, which is sort of the more standard way of doing these things, those boxes are really just provided as a reference, but we're going to mostly ignore them for doing the exercises. So here, I'm just going to walk through the kind of create, read, update, delete actions that you can do in Fedora. And again, if you were using Islandora, Samvera, something like that, these are the kinds of things that your framework, your application would be taking care of for you. But the point here is just to show what this looks like at the Fedora layer. So I'm going to go create a basic container, and I'm going to call it image-collection at the top level of my repository. So let me just walk through this briefly here, and I can probably zoom in a little bit to make this more visible. So what we're viewing here is just the top level kind of root resource in the repository. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a bunch of toggles for doing things. So here is kind of your create a new resource button. It gives you a few options. We're really only going to be doing basic containers and binaries today. In a future workshop, we could talk about some of these more advanced features, but we won't need to use them for the workshop today. Just basic containers and binaries are the way that most people will be interacting with Fedora. When you create a container, you can give it an identifier or let Fedora generate one for you. You can also pre-populate a resource with RDF if you have it. A lot of the time you won't, and you'll just be creating an empty resource and then building on it later. You're also able to update the properties of a resource. So I was showing these earlier. Usually this would be kind of descriptive metadata that you're trying to add as an RDF property. It could be other types of metadata, administrative metadata, or security metadata, those sorts of things. So again, here, I'm just going to create a basic container. So I'm going to leave that where it is. And I'm going to give it an identifier of image dash collection. So you can just type that in. And I'm going to hit the add button. And when that action completes, the URL at the top updates to indicate that I am at this new resource that I've created that I named image collection. There's also a little breadcrumb trail, so I can sort of go back to the home and a series of properties that'll just let you know when it was created and modified, and a few other kind of administrative details. And again, Aaron, just let me know if there's a question I should respond to, but I'll keep going here otherwise. So this next slide 25 here, just telling you that when you create that resource, it'll redirect you to it. So you'll be at that resource. And then we're going to create another resource as a child of this image collection. So just building out kind of a basic repository hierarchy. And we're going to call this one Andromeda Galaxy. Feel free to copy and paste from the slides too, if it's easier for you. That's why we shared them out. So I'm going to go back here. I'm at my image collection. I'm going to create another basic container. I'm just going to paste this in so I don't get typos. I'm going to call it Andromeda Galaxy and hit the add button. So you can see here the URL keeps changing to include the new identifier that I've added each time, and the breadcrumb trail updates. So you can go back the image collection, or you can go back home and kind of navigate back and forth within the structure of the repository. So the next slide here is really just describing what's happening there, just to give you a sense of technically what's occurring with the sort of retrieval of the resource that you just created. But we'll go to slide 27, and here is where we'll be talking about binaries. So we created a couple of containers. These are the metadata resources. We'll add some metadata to them as well, just so you can see how that looks. Next, we're going to upload a binary file. So again, this could be anything. Here, there's a link if you want to upload this specific binary to the Andromeda Galaxy. If you prefer, you can just upload any file or image that's relatively small that's sitting on your hard drive at the moment, but you can grab the specific image if you want. I'm just going to highlight this. So if you have that, on the next slide here, we're going to go ahead and create that as a binary. So I'm going to go to this Andromeda Galaxy container that I created. I'm going to change the type to binary, give it an identifier of andromeda.jpg, and then I'm going to browse for that file. So you'll see that here when I'm on the Andromeda Galaxy container. If I switch from basic container to binary, it gives me a little browse button that I can use to search for a file. So I'm going to paste in the identifier here of andromeda.jpg, and then I'm just going to browse my computer for where I stored that Andromeda JPEG file. Again, feel free to upload any small file. It's really just for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to hit the add button. And so you can see here the screen is a little bit different. It is now showing me Andromeda.jpg rather than one of the containers. And since this is a binary file, you get a few more buttons. There's a download button, which will let you download the content just as you uploaded. There's a fixity button, which you can hit now if you want. We'll be talking about that a little bit more later when we talk about fixity. And the properties are a little bit different. It detects the file name and the MIME type and includes those, and just gives a little bit of the technical metadata. For example, the SHA-512 checksum, which gets computed when you ingest it, as well as the file size. So that just kind of happens automatically when you upload the file. It does some basic characterization. And here again is just kind of describing what's happening when you're retrieving that file. So on slide number 30, here we're just showing how to update properties. So, and a little bit of navigation. We're going to add a Dublin core title using the update properties. We're going to add it as RDF, so using the RDF schema. And that's where this sort of delete, insert, where thing shows up. This is using an RDF language called Sparkle, specifically Sparkle Update. That's SPARQL. And it just has its own sort of unique syntax, which we won't spend a lot of time on here today. You could do a whole workshop on kind of doing this stuff, but it's basically inserting RDF triples. So here, all we're saying is this sort of open closed brackets indicate that I'm operating on this particular resource. DC title is what I'm adding, and Andromeda Galaxy is the title that I want to add. So if I just copy that and then flip back over, I'm not going to add it to the JPEG itself. I'm going to add it to the object that the container that describes the JPEG. So I'm going to go up one in the breadcrumb trail and just click Andromeda Galaxy. And when you're there, let me just reload. Yeah. So here I can go down to update properties and scroll to the bottom. And you'll see I have this delete, insert, where that's indicated here. This is just a template. All of these other things are common prefixes, so common metadata schemas. So you don't have to go search for the schema that you're trying to add. Dublin core is pretty common, and it's right there. So I'm just going to highlight these three and then replace. Again, I'm just copying and pasting from the slides here. So all I'm telling Fedora to do here is just insert a Dublin core title called Andromeda Galaxy. If I hit the update button, so you'll see here now I have a DC title, Andromeda Galaxy. So it just adds it to that resource. You might have noticed too that I do have this children link here that will link me to the JPEG that I uploaded, because it's a child of this Andromeda Galaxy container. If you don't see that, just refreshing your page will work. Sometimes it gets cached and doesn't appear right away. And again, the slide is just illustrating what that looks like. So the next slide, so we've done a create operation. We've been doing read operations and sort of viewing these files and these containers, and now we'll do a delete operation just to kind of cover all of the resource management stuff. So I'm going to navigate over to, again, I'll just use this child reference or this children reference to go to andromeda.jpg. And I'll scroll all the way to the bottom, and there's a big red delete button. It really will delete the resource. There's no check here. It won't ask you for sure, it just deletes it. Normally, if you're running, again, Islandora, Sambera, any application on top of Fedora, those applications would have sort of checks involved and may in fact not delete the resource immediately. There's a variety of ways to handle that. But since we're interacting directly with the Fedora API here, we're really, by clicking this button, we're just issuing a delete command, the same as we would on the command line. So hitting delete does get rid of that resource. And then if you hit the back button in your browser, you'll probably still see it. But if you reload that page, you should see what we call a tombstone. And I'll zoom in a little bit here. This is really just showing you that the resource used to exist at this location, and it was deleted, and it gives you a timestamp for when it was deleted. The reason we do this is just having to do with linked data best practices. Generally speaking, you shouldn't reuse persistent identifiers, URIs that you publish on the web, because if you put up some kind of a data set and then changed, someone referenced it and then you deleted it and replaced it with something totally different, then you've kind of broken that link. And so we try to enforce good practices by saying if you delete a resource, you can't reuse the same identifier. In practice, if you're in development or if you do want to actually reuse that identifier, you can. There's a command you can use to delete tombstones. So this isn't forced on you, but it is kind of something that Fedora encourages as part of a best practice to not reuse URIs in, once they've been publicly published.
And the other question here is, will the deleted resource always show up as a child of its parent?
So, in the deleted resource, it'll show up wherever it happened to be in the repository. So in this case, I'm creating, I created this Andromeda.jpg as a child of the Andromeda Galaxy resource. If I'd wanted to, I could have created it at the top level of the repository or anywhere else. So unlike Fedora 3, you're not forced to create binary files as children of things. They can just be their own independent resources. But generally speaking, it's common to structure things where you create a container first and then create kind of binary files that are children of that container. But that isn't always necessarily the case. It'll appear sort of wherever it happens to be created.
And I might just direct your attention, David, there's just one more question came in. If you just want to open up the question and answer window,
sure.
If you're able.
Yep. Yes. So the question of when you uploaded your JPEG file, it appears in the URI. So if you don't, I'm assuming in that case, let me just go back. So here, if you upload a binary file, but you don't actually put anything in the identifier field, Fedora will automatically generate a URI that looks like that. So you may have forgotten to actually put Andromeda.jpg as an identifier, and you can test this again if you want by uploading something else and putting in any identifier you want. Okay, looks like that's yeah. And the .jpg is arbitrary. It's the identifier can be anything you want. We're kind of using, in the context of this workshop, fairly easy to read URIs. That sort of long sequence of letters and numbers that Fedora automatically generated may in fact be a better way to create identifiers anyway. If you're going live with the repository and all of your URIs are embedded with sort of semantic meaning, that can be problematic if the meaning of a resource changes over time, or if the collection that it's part of changes over time. So in some cases, people do advocate for just using opaque, identifiers of the kind that Fedora automatically generates. But for the purposes of the workshop, we're using very simple, easy to read identifiers. And if you do type it in to the identifier box, that's what you'll get. But if you type nothing in here, then Fedora will give you just a random identifier for that resource. Okay, so jumping back in here, and again, some of these slides are just meant to be easy for you to go back and reference later. This is just describing what's going on. And let me know if there's further questions on that. That covers everything I wanted to say about sort of basic resource management. I'll now go on to some of the other features here. So the next one is versioning. So when you're using Fedora, versions are created either automatically or on demand via the REST API. And this is configurable when you first start up your repository. So you can set it up so every time you make a change, a version is created, or you can set it up so that no versions are created unless you explicitly tell Fedora to create a version on this particular change. And in terms of version retrieval, this is where we're using the Memento protocol, which I'll say a bit more in a moment here.
I just have a question here. Is there a mechanism for batch uploading files?
So if you're using a framework like Islandora or Samvera, they do have tools for batch upload. If you're migrating from a previous version of Fedora, the tools that we have do support sort of batch upload scenarios. There's not really a native sort of Fedora utility right now for doing batch uploads, but if that's your use case where you're using Fedora with like a custom front end, there are various ways to kind of you can write a script that will batch upload against the Fedora API, but there are different ways to do that, and I think if you have a particular framework in mind, feel free to drop me an email. I can connect you with some of the Fedora technical team members, or pop onto Slack and ask some questions. We have some links later. The short answer is that there's nothing built into Fedora that allows you to do that, because it is just based on a REST API, which is generally based on kind of atomic one-at-a-time operations. But there are tools that exist depending on your front end, and it's possible to build tools that will allow you to do batch uploads. But the framework you're using matters a lot. So if you're considering something like Islandora or Samvera, at that level, there definitely are tools. So just a few notes here about versions. What is a version in the context of Fedora? It is itself a resource. So if you create a version of a container, that version is itself a container. It has an identifier. You can link to it independently. It is essentially a snapshot. So it contains the contents of a resource at a point in time. And it's immutable. So once you create a version, you can't change it. It's kind of a historical record. It has a date associated with it down to the second, and this is something the Memento protocol uses to find it. It's discoverable, so you can actually ask a resource if it has any versions, and it will tell you. We'll see that shortly. And there's a versioning API that's within the overall Fedora API, and that versioning API is used to create versions of resources. So there's just a link here. I'm not going to say a ton about the Memento specification, but it's an emerging standard that's used for asking websites for versions of content at particular times. It's actually used by places like the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, and you can sort of say, there's actually a Chrome browser plugin for this, but if you know the semantics, you can go to a website that supports Memento and say, give me this web page as close as possible to this date and time, and it'll respond accordingly. There's a few key concepts here. So the Memento is sort of the version of the original resource. So we tend to talk about them as versions in Fedora. For the Memento protocol, the version is a memento. They use these concepts of time gates and time maps. Time gate is sort of this endpoint that you can use to issue your queries, and then the time map is the list of mementos. In the context of Fedora, we often just talk about them as versions in the list of versions, but they do map onto these memento concepts. And then, of course, the original resource, which is what you versioned. So we'll experiment with this a little bit by creating a new resource in Fedora and then kind of modifying it and seeing the change happen to the version. So I'm going to go to my image collection resource, and I'm going to create a new container, and I'm just going to give it an ID of map. So here, Andromeda Galaxy, back 1 to image collection, new basic container, identifier of map. I'll click the add button.
While you're working there, David, there's a question here. Can I version all resources, containers, as well as binaries?
Yes, you can. So you can version a container, but you can also version a binary. It's just that it has to actually be a different binary or an updated version of that binary. But yes, you can absolutely, if you updated a binary with a new version of it, you can tell Fedora to create a new version, and then it'll store both of those as a historical record. So you can go back to previous versions of binaries as well as containers. So this is this map resource that I just created. And then in the next slide here, oops, sorry about that. I started skipping slides. You'll see if you scroll down this versioning section, and it'll tell you here that auto versioning is enabled. That is just the default that Fedora ships with, and so all of these instances, basically every time you make a change, it's creating versions. You can turn that off when in your repository configuration and just version on demand. So just to see what this looks like, I'm going to modify this resource. Again, this is just a simple DC title thing. We're not doing anything too complicated. I happen to live in Nova Scotia, so I'm just going to say that this is a map of Nova Scotia. Feel free to make this a map of a place of your choosing. But I'm on my map resource. Scroll down to update properties, highlight these 3 delete insert where statements, and replace it with what I just copied from the slides. I'll hit the update button. And you can see here, Fedora does, just in the HTML web interface, it changes the name at the top to reflect the title, but the URI has not changed. You can see that in your navigation bar.
David, there's another question here. Could you specify some use cases requiring a new version? Is it mainly for fixing errors?
Yeah, I think there's a few use cases. So sometimes institutions are doing things like progressively updating metadata on a resource. They may have, metadata that comes in and changes over time, or maybe they have some metadata today and some later. And by creating versions, you kind of keep a snapshot history. And then if someone makes a mistake, instead of having to, redo everything, you can kind of go back in history and kind of revert to a previous state of a resource that is good. And this could particularly be helpful if you have, students or volunteers or people that are kind of in your, making changes to resources in your repository. So yeah, versioning is one use case, is certainly for error tracking. Another use case has to do with sort of preservation actions. So Fedora doesn't force you to create versions, but for a lot of folks in the preservation community, the act of creating a version is itself an indication that you're saying that this particular resource is now ready to be kind of preserved. It's a kind of a snapshot that you want to say, this is preservation ready, and I want to preserve this snapshot of this resource. And then the resource might still continue to change, but you've got that version of it that you want to preserve, and you can maintain as many of those as you want. So I think there's a few different use cases, but yeah, in my mind, it's sort of preservation actions on the one hand, and sort of guarding against errors on the other, and being able to roll back if someone makes a mistake. So I've added here, again, you should see the title. And if you go down to the bottom, now if I click the View Versions button, I should see 2 versions. They're timestamped, so they are here for, I've only created these a couple minutes apart, so the timestamps are very similar. But if you click on the first one, you'll see there is no title. It does tell you this is a historic version, so you can't modify it. And if I go back and then click the second one, it does have this title that I added. And we don't have functionality in this interface yet to sort of delete and restore versions, but you can do that on the command line. And if you're using, again, an application like Islandora, it'll allow you to do that. The functionality is just built into a higher layer in the software stack. But yeah, so you've got this sort of list of versions, and you can browse them and potentially delete or restore them if you needed to. There's more you can do. Again, the HTML interface only exposes a subset of the total functionality. I do have a link here to the documentation that just kind of shows other things you can do, finding a closest version to a specific date and things like that that could potentially be exposed through the web interface, your kind of public-facing application as well. Since this is a fairly brief workshop, I'm not going to go, I don't have a hands-on exercises for authorization for the web access control. We do have documentation on this, but it's a little bit more involved if doing this manually through adding different RDF relationships and properties and things like that. But this does let you control security in your repository, control what users and groups can access particular resources or groups of resources in the repository. I will do a quick fixity demo, and if you're not familiar with fixity, this is just checksums basically. So getting a checksum of a file at a point in time and being able to compare that, make sure that it hasn't changed. Files can become corrupt over time, so you can sort of use fixity to continuously verify that your files haven't changed and haven't become corrupt. So when you ingest something, you can provide a known fixity value with it, and then Fedora will calculate and compare and let you know if the fixity value Fedora calculates is the same as the value you've provided. But if it's a new resource and you don't already have a checksum for it, Fedora will just calculate and store that checksum on ingest, and then on demand, you can recalculate a checksum and then compare it to the one that's been stored. And so that's how you can sort of check fixity over time on resources. There are limitations, of course. So this is another use case for versioning, actually. So if you're versioning binary files, you can always roll back if you have sort of a snapshot. Also, having a backup strategy is important. It only works in content in Fedora. Fedora does support external content. So if you store stuff outside of Fedora, that's totally fine. You can link to it, but Fedora won't manage those checksums for you. And it supports a few different checksum algorithms for people that have different needs there. We deleted the binary we created, so if you want to add a new one just to see what fixity looks like, there's a link here to one that we used in a previous workshop called Parade. I'm going to add this to the image collection and just kind of demonstrate the fixity button very quickly. So if I go to image collection, binary, call this parade.jpg. I downloaded this previously, but again, you can upload whatever you want. Click add. So I have this binary, and if I click the fixity button, what's happening there is Fedora is recalculating the checksum that it originally stored, which is here. And it tells me success, which means that the checksum and the file size matched. And if they didn't, it would report a failure of the fixity. And what you choose to do with that information is sort of up to the other processes that you kind of have in place. But Fedora does allow you to calculate and report that information. So, and just by way of conclusion on that fixity works as part of Fedora's preservation tooling. Just to help you maintain your resources over time. I do have a little bit here on the new simple search feature. Again, this is kind of built into Fedora now. It supports very simple queries. There is an internal database index that keeps track of all of your resources. It's configurable. There's a couple of different options there. Postgres and MySQL are very common, but it's configurable. And if you want to see this in the interface, there is a search button now. So I'll flip over. If I go to the top, there's this search button. This is new. And if you click this, the default query is just kind of give me everything. And it just gives you a few, show you kind of the resources that are currently in your repository. And it gives you here different fields that you can search on and different operators that you can use, greater than, less than, equal to, etc. We're only going to touch on this briefly, but there is some documentation on the simple search on our wiki in the documentation, which I have here. If you want to dive into this feature in a lot of detail, but we can do some really simple queries. So, for example, if I want to find that map resource I just created, I can search on Fedora ID is equal to. I'll just use the asterisk because map is not the full URI. It's just part of the URI. So this is just saying, give me any URI that starts with anything but ends with map. So if I did Fedora ID equal to star.map, submit. Oh, and of course, doing things live does not. Sorry, not star.map, just star map. I had it correct in my slide and did it incorrectly in the demo, but that extra period shouldn't be there because it's not in the URI. So star map will give you, pull back this map resource. You can navigate to it. It gives you some basic information here. in the search results. Similarly, you can do something if you wanted to find a search by MIME type. You could do something like star JPEG, looking for MIME type and equals to, so field MIME type, keep the operator, star JPEG, and that'll pull back that parade resource because the MIME type is recorded as image / JPEG, JPEG. This is just meant to give you a sense of what's possible here. There's a bunch of different fields you can search on, and a bunch of different ways to pull back information. The documentation goes into a lot more detail on this if you want to know kind of what's possible. But this is primarily for folks that are kind of working on Fedora as a developer or ingesting content and want to be able to get back information quickly without having to use an external search index.
There's a question here, David. It says, does Fedora 6 support multiple inheritance? If a resource has more than one parent container, does it have separate URIs for each?
So you can have multiple inheritance in the sense that a container, a resource can belong to more than one collection, but it's only in the repository once. So the URI won't change. It'll be whatever you first created it as, but that container will have multiple relationships with multiple collections. So I'm not sure if I can show this, but let me just see what this looks like. Okay, so in this case, we're just using the basic repository structure, but you can add as many membership resource membership relationships as you want. So for example, if this Andromeda Galaxy belonged to more than one collection, it could have an is member of relationship with one collection and another is member of relationship with a different collection. It won't change any of the URIs, but you'll be able to follow those links through because it'll just be linked semantically rather than structurally. So just a quick note here on the messaging, which again, we're not demonstrating as part of this workshop. This is just Fedora, but the messaging service really lets you set up what are called asynchronous interactions. So basically, anytime any change happens in the repository, you create something, change it or delete it, Fedora sends out a message, and you can set up infrastructure that listens for those messages and does things with them. We have some infrastructure. We're using Apache Camel, and there's a Camel toolbox that has a few different patterns for integration. But this is what we tend to think of as external services. So you can have things like, and actually maybe I can pop into my full screen because the demo stuff is pretty much over here. So you can have services that listen for these messages, and it's pretty fault tolerant. So you can set it up so that if a message doesn't get picked up, it'll keep trying until the message gets served. And this is useful for doing things. Yeah, I mentioned that Fedora has a basic built-in search, but for public-facing content, most people are going to use something like Solr or Elasticsearch, and this can be set up. You don't have to write code for this. This already basically exists. So that every time something changes in your repository, it updates an external search index that the public can search. And Islandora and Samvera already have patterns for doing this, but Fedora also has a Camel infrastructure that lets you do this. Similarly, if you're interested in linked data, you can use any triple store with Fedora. Fedora doesn't have a built-in triple store. It stores all of the triples, which sounds a little bit confusing, but it doesn't support sort of the kinds of queries that a triple store like BlazeGraph, for example, would support. But that's because you can use any triple store you want. They all perform in different ways. And using the same kind of patterns, you can just index all of your content to this triple store, which is actually kind of nice because if you change to a different one, Fedora doesn't even really know about it. The stuff is all just getting externally indexed. So we haven't found that many people that are using triple stores really aggressively with Fedora, but I'd certainly be interested to hear from folks if there are these kind of linked data use cases out there that you want to support. Finally, I just have a few slides here about what's going on, sort of what's next, and then we do have a little bit of time for questions if there's anything that I've missed. So in terms of 2021, we are, as this workshop is focused on, releasing Fedora 6.0. In December, we released the first alpha. I believe we've had 2 alphas before moving to a beta release in February. And that beta is feature complete, and it's pretty solid. We've done a lot of testing, a lot of automated testing, but the community has also done a lot of testing. And our plan, if there's no major showstopper bugs, is to get to a release ideally in the second quarter of this year, so say by the end of June. So we're pretty excited about that, being able to get this software out. But in the meantime, if you're interested in digging into this a little bit more, we do have a beta, and you can test it in a variety of ways. There's a really simple kind of desktop client that you can use. There's a Docker setup. There is this AWS deployer that lets you deploy in Amazon. And again, feel free to shoot me an email or something like that if you want further instructions, if you can't quite find through these links how to do that. And there are also migration tools. So the tools that will get you from version 3, 4, and 5 to 6. The community's been testing those and we've been improving them. But again, we'd love to get more testing. And for those going from version 3 to 6, we are close to completing a validator that will check all of your content and make sure that it came over okay. So most of that's available for testing except for the validator, but that should be available soon. I do want to mention, of course, that all of this is only possible because of our members. Fedora, as I said, is a community-supported program. My position, Aaron's position, as well as Danny Bernstein, who's the tech lead, is all funded through membership. These are just our current members. I want to be sure to say thank you for all the support, and just encourage anyone who's not currently a member, if you're using Fedora, if you do decide to adopt Fedora, if you find it useful and valuable, membership's really important. It's the only way we can kind of sustain these programs over time and make sure that they're still continuously updated and useful, and that we can put on things like this workshop, user group events, and everything else we try to do to engage with the community. So I've got a couple of resources here, the user documentation, if you want to dig into that, some of the design and development stuff, including the performance testing that we've been doing. And we have a variety of communication channels if you're not already on those. I'll back out of these slides for a moment here. One thing I will say, just while folks are thinking about questions, we are also, you may know, working on a grant project that was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services to support Fedora 3 to 6 migrations. Part of that work involves developing some training materials. So we do intend to do more kind of focused workshops targeted, some of them a little bit more technical as well, but focused on things like how to actually do a migration using the utilities. But if there are other topics for future trainings that you'd like to see, let us know about those as well.